The movie opens on a shot of a crow sitting on an old wooden sign that says private road. A black SUV drives past with 5 passengers. Chris is driving and Johnny is in the passenger seat. They discuss what they are going to do this summer. The other passengers are asleep in the back. They are Scott, Brian and Natalie. Suddenly some crows hit the windscreen and the SUV crashes off the road into a cornfield. Some moments later all the passengers regain consciousness but Johnny is missing. As they look for Johnny, Scott tries to get a signal on his phone but to no avail. Chris notices a gap in the corn and suspects that Johnny may have gone that way. Natalie and Brian are a couple. Brian thinks that Chris doesn't like him. Brian suggests that he could run back to the gas station. Before he can leave, Scott spots a farmhouse through the cornfield and thinks that Johnny may have gone there. Brian and Scott start to walk through the corn towards the house whilst Natalie and Chris wait with the SUV and smoke. Scott is out of breath as he is not as fit as Brian. They chat as they walk but Brian begins to suspect that they are going the wrong way. They discover an old mailbox and an abandoned car in the corn. Scott finds an area of flattened corn with what appears to be a dead creature on the ground. Brian is examining the car when Scott calls him. The windscreen of this car also appears to be covered in dead crows. Scott has discovered a scarecrow attached to a wooden cross. He climbs up the cross in order to get his bearings. He is face to face with the scarecrow and complains that it smells. He can see the house in the distance and can see a light go on in an upstairs window. Back at the SUV, Chris is trying to get it started again. Chris takes a torch out of the glove box as Natalie takes some tablets. She goes to examine a sign in the corn and as she reads it she sees a boy hiding in the corn looking at her. He runs. Brian and Scott reach the house. Brian goes forward and knocks on the door. It opens and they enter and look around. The house looks abandoned and untidy. They hear a noise upstairs. The sun is starting to set as Natalie searches along the road, looking through the corn for the boy. She finds a scarecrow laying on the ground and as she examines it she finds that it has human teeth. As she screams, Chris runs over. He tries to calm her and as she storms back to the SUV Chris glances back at the scarecrow. Natalie wants to go and find Brian. Chris grabs the torch and follows her through the corn. Meanwhile at the house, Brian and Scott walk up the stairs. Brian opens a door and they enter a room that has bloodstains all over the wall. There is someone in the corner of the room operating a sewing machine. It turns out to be Johnny. He is in a trance and covered in blood. He looks like a zombie. Johnny has nails through his fingers and he is sewing a scarecrow mask out of hessian material. He stops and holds up the mask. Suddenly he falls down over the sewing machine and the light bulb goes out. During this time, Natalie reaches the mailbox and car. She hears something in the corn and begins to get scared. Something runs past her several times, cutting her each time. Chris and Brian both hear her scream and run to help. Chris arrives first and sees her but she is dragged away. He chases after her but bumps into Brian. By now the sun is setting. Scott is standing alone outside the house. As night falls, Brian and Chris find Natalie hanging upside down from a wooden cross, covered in blood. Brian rushes to her and holds her but a rope around her feet pulls her higher. Brian goes to find out who is pulling the rope but cannot find anyone. Meanwhile, Chris can hear voices and Natalie's eyes start to glow. He runs away through the corn as Brian cuts Natalie's ropes. Chris arrives at the house through the corn and meets Scott. Chris says that someone is after them and they need to leave. Brian picks up Natalie and runs through the corn. He is being chased. As he stops, a scarecrow grabs the rope that is still attached to Natalie and drags her away. Brian gives chase and knocks the scarecrow to the ground. The scarecrow doesn't move. Another scarecrow knocks Brian away, onto his back. This second scarecrow lays over Brian looking straight into his face for some seconds and then runs away, dragging Natalie with him. Brian has injured his shoulder in the altercation. Brian runs to the house and meets Scott outside. A scarecrow attempts to grab them but it doesn't leave the cornfield. As Chris searches the house, Scott returns upstairs to the sewing room and discovers that Johnny has gone. Chris says that they are surrounded by the cornfield. Scott wants to return to the SUV but Chris thinks that they are trapped. Brian is angry with Chris for not sticking around to help Natalie. Brian looks out of the window, takes a torch and he and Scott leave. As they walk around the clearing, Scott spies a scarecrow in the cornfield. Chris continues to search the house and examines some old pictures of a family on the wall. He tries the telephone but it is dead. Outside, under a weather vane, Brian and Scott examine some cars to see if any are usable. They check for keys but the cars are full of cobwebs and the windows are damaged. However, they do find a Chevy under a cover that is in good condition but they cannot find the keys. As they search the garage, Brian finds some rifle shells in a box as Scott spies a scarecrow laying on the bench. He takes a closer look and it lurches towards him. Brian helps him up but doesn't see the attack. As Scott stands, he seems to have a vision. It is daylight and he sees a farmer teaching his son Alex how to slaughter a pig. The farmer suddenly looks in Scott's direction and walks towards him. However, he walks straight past Scott and slaps his other son Corey and tells him to come over and do it. Corey looks at Alex with jealousy in his eyes. Brian snaps Scott out of his trance. Chris finds some car keys in the house. As he turns, he sees a figure in the doorway watching him. As the figure runs away, Chris chases with a knife. He goes up the stairs and shuts himself in the sewing room. He is using his lighter to see when suddenly the light goes on and he drops his lighter. Through the window, he sees someone enter the house. Door to the sewing room opens. It is dead Natalie. She is covered in blood and sits at the sewing machine. The door slams closed behind her. Brian and Scott return to the house. Scott calls for Chris, but he is unable to open the door. Natalie hammers nails into her fingers. Scott says that the door is locked from the inside. Brian tries to break the door down, shouting for Natalie as she starts to sew. Brian runs down the stairs and Scott tells Chris to climb out of the window onto the roof ledge. Chris lifts the window to climb out. As he hangs from the window, Natalie stops sewing and looks towards him. The window falls onto his fingers and he falls to the ground. There he lies unconscious. Brian returns with an axe and runs upstairs to the sewing room, but Natalie is gone. Brian yells in frustration. Chris regains consciousness surrounded by Brian and Scott. Brian demands to know where Natalie is. Chris replies that she is dead. Scott diffuses the situation and suggests that they leave. Chris has found the keys to the Chevy, but Brian won't leave without Natalie and takes the keys from Chris. Scott goes outside and has another vision. He sees Corey in the corn who beckons him to follow. Suddenly it is daylight and Scott follows Corey toward a scarecrow. Alex is examining the scarecrow when Corey stabs him several times with a pitchfork. Scott comes out of his vision. It is night again and he is in the cornfield with rope around his legs. He is dragged up onto a wooden cross and cries for Brian and Chris. As a scarecrow approaches, it strokes his face. There are nails in its fingers and it uses the nails to slash Scott. It falls to the ground as Brian appears with an axe and chops the scarecrow. They return to the house. While Chris finds some dressing, Scott explains his vision. As Brian arms himself, Chris tries to convince Scott that they should leave. Scott decides to stay with Brian. They go together down to the basement. As they search, Scott has a vision of a zombified creature that attacks him. Brian manages to calm Scott, but then they notice a corpse in front of them holding a rifle. Brian takes the rifle. Meanwhile, Chris hotwires the Chevy and drives it away through the cornfield. Brian grabs the rifle shells from the garage as Chris crashes into a wooden cross. The car won't start and there is a scarecrow laying on the bonnet. Chris tries to open the door, but it is stuck, so he climbs across to the passenger side. Another scarecrow crashes through the passenger window. He kicks it out, but the scarecrow on the bonnet smashes its head through the windscreen to get in. Chris pulls its mask off and it stops moving. It's Johnny. Brian arrives and gets Chris out of the car, telling him to run. He points the rifle at the other scarecrow but won't shoot as he suspects it is Natalie. He asks her to say something as she approaches, but it attacks her and Brian is flailing on the ground. Scott is having another vision. In the daylight, Corey comes through the corn and into the sewing room where he makes a scarecrow mask. The farmer asks about his brother, but he doesn't answer. Corey returns to Alex, puts the mask on his face and hoists him up onto the cross disguised as a scarecrow as night falls. Scott is still in front of the house. Chris arrives back and tells Scott what happened. Scott wonders why they weren't attacked as they first walked through the corn and surmises that perhaps as one person is being converted to a scarecrow, no one else is able to be attacked. Suddenly Brian walks through the door in a zombified state and heads for the sewing room. Chris says that this must end. Scott goes back toward the garage to get fuel as Chris tries to retrieve his lighter from underneath the sewing machine as Brian works. As Chris is on the floor, Brian suddenly stops working and looks at him. Chris grabs the lighter and runs. Brian continues his task. Scott is outside waiting for Chris and they run through the cornfield pouring fuel behind them until they reach the Chevy. Chris is searching for the shotgun. Brian finishes sewing and the lights go out as a scarecrow charges at Scott. Chris finds the shotgun and shoots it. They continue to run through the corn shooting at scarecrows. They reach the mailbox and start to wonder why the scarecrows have stopped. Brian runs out of the house. Scott and Chris split up. He can't chase them both. They agree to meet at the road. Chris tries to shoot Brian, but Brian runs at him and pushes him back onto a stick that goes straight through his body. Brian stands up behind him and then runs at him, slashing at his body. Chris manages to remove Brian's mask and he falls to the ground. Scott continues to pour fuel as he runs. He tries to light the fuel, but the lighter won't work. A scarecrow grabs him, ties rope around his legs and drags him back through the corn where the scarecrow proceeds to slash Chris. Scott remembers his vision of Corey stabbing Alex and looks for the pitchfork. He uses it to stab the Scarecrow. As he tries to escape, the Scarecrow drags him back, but Chris grabs the Scarecrow and shouts for Scott to run. The Scarecrow kills Chris with the pitchfork. Scott reaches the road and sees a car pull up to the SUV. He is unable to call out to the new arrivals. A couple are checking the crashed SUV when a Scarecrow appears through the corn and lays down between Scott and the SUV. The man suddenly notices Scott and walks towards him to help. Scott is unable to call out to warn him. The screen fades to black. Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications, and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching. You should check these recaps.